Good evening. My name is Donald Daniels, and I chose the book God Behaving Badly is the God of the Old Testament angry, sexist, and racist. This book was written by David Lamb. David Lamb is an associate professor of Old Testament Biblical Theology Seminary in Hartfield, Pennsylvania. He has taught extensively in various cross-cultural contexts. He is also the author of Righteous Yehu and His Evil Heirs. I chose this book because I too have questioned some of the things that God has that has been recorded about God in the Old Testament, and I also noticed that in the New Testament there is very little recorded concerning God, as in his actions, outside of the fact that he gave his only begotten Son Jesus, and he spoke at Jesus's baptism, as well as on the mountain where he was transfigured before Peter, James, and John. David Lamb begins his this book in chapter 1 asking questions about how does one reconcile the God of the Old Testament with the God of the New Testament. He reminds us of many of the things that the God of the Old Testament did and commanded his people to do with regards to society. And things that if we would look at today would be things that a mean tyrant king or dictator would do. For instance, he ordered the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, destroying every living soul in the city, including Lot's wife, who looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. And this was done after Abraham had pleaded with him that if he could find, beginning with 50 righteous men, and God challenged him to do that, and if he did, he would not destroy it. Also, he commanded Israel to go into the land of Canaan and take the land from them. And I always questioned that. David Lamb dealt with that as well. Women were considered property of men and were considered worthless if they had no husband. And next question he asks is God loving or is God angry? And this chapter also interested me because I don't know that anyone looks at the things that God did in Egypt and labeled him as an unjust God. Those 10 plagues that he put upon Egypt, including the killing of the firstborn child, which we would consider to be a very evil thing that someone would do. However, because of the Egyptians' treatment of the Hebrews by killing their baby boys at birth and putting the Hebrews in slavery, we have no compassion, and this was brought out by David Lamb in his book. I've always wondered why the God of Israel took the land of the Canaanites, and like Egypt, God got angry at the crimes that Egypt and Canaan did, especially against the Hebrews, and he finally delivered Israel from enslavement and provided them with a homeland. Another question that David Lamb posed to us was whether God is a sexist or is he affirming. And many people argue for God concerning the Bible because that he is sexist. However, Lamb points out that if you ever sat down with someone and listened to someone who is sexist, you may have a different opinion. Even listen to someone who at one time was a Christian and chose to now not be a Christian because of what she read about God and how God seemed to be sexist. Genesis chapter 3 portrays the sin of man as initially being caused by a woman disobeying a commandment of God. And we are introduced to Eve in chapter 2 as being one who was taken from the side of Adam. But in chapter 3, she is the one who was easily persuaded to disobey God and take a bite of the forbidden fruit. Other women in the Bible were second wives to men when God had clearly commanded men not to commit adultery. The wife, the mother of Samuel, was the second wife of her husband. Solomon had 700 wives, and Jesus said in the New Testament that if a man divorces his wife and she remarries, she commits adultery. But he did not say that if the man remarries, that he would commit adultery, only if the woman remarries. I really, as I read this book, I confused myself with who the writer or the author of the book was. I knew it was written by David Lamb, but I also confused it with Wright or Craig, simply because their writings were similar. I did appreciate David Lamb because he made his book really very interesting. It was one that kept your attention as you read the book, and I personally would encourage my classmates to read this book. This is, as I said, God behaving badly is our God, an angry God, a sexist God, and does God have a bad reputation? I could go on and on concerning the book. I will continue to read it and get more ideas, perhaps include it in a apologetics class in the future. Thank you, and may God bless you and God keep you is my prayer.